Hi everyone. Given that it is my specialist area, I've got a lot I'd like to talk about. There's a lot I've had to just let go of in order to make this lecture work well enough. So without any further ado, let's just get going. Education and work are some of the ideas I want to make clear. Bingham makes this point. Double significance to the reproductive nature. Please note the hyphen is deliberate. The reproductive nature of education. On one hand, education reproduces normed self-sensibilities, and on the other, it's a prime location for production, where there's a potential for other forms of self to be created. While education reproduces, it also produces. That is practice theory in a nutshell, in many, many ways. Bingham's capturing around education. I would put it to you that if we can put this idea to any sociological phenomenon we care to talk about. But education is particularly fertile ground in which to consider both that reproductive, the recreation of the society as is, as well as the ability we have to create something new out of all of this. Reminder of what I said in the introduction. Grasping the implications of ascription and achievement, understanding the idea of habitus, cultural capital and its applications, understanding differences between reproductionist and modernization approaches to education, and further developing your understanding of practice structuration theory as a way through, in between these two conflicting ideas. Let's have a think about the transition to work, just for a moment. And this is what Crook and his occupational returns to cultural participation in Australia was discussing in this paper that I mentioned earlier. He presents in this paper an excellent summary of modernisation structural functional theory versus a reproductionist. Well worth reading if you get the chance. His conclusion is that Australia is indeed an achievement-based society, and he bases it on research he does, statistical analysis he does, of the transition from university to work. And in this he shows that people who may have highly cultured views of the world and highly cultured practices, by which he means opera, classical music, literature and so on, don't necessarily do better than people coming out of university with a more, shall we call it, lowbrow perspective on life. That's one of the reasons he bases it on, and he says that what we see is the strongest correlation we can find is between university achievement and employment. So employment is an ability to be employed is strongly correlated to university success. Educational attainment is the most important determinant of entry to the professions and to elites, is the point he makes there. But my problem with his argument is this, that he skips over the issues associated with school selection and success. So what he doesn't deal with is the ways in which people actually get to university in the first place, and those who are left behind in that struggle to get there. The structural imbalances are ignored prior to university. So he treats that as this some sort of a level playing field. And I think Tranter, who you've been reading earlier, wouldn't disagree with the point he's making at that level. But her point is, and the point that I would want to emphasize is, who gets there? Who gets there in the first place, and how do we deal with this? So how does one get to achieve in this very first place, in terms of the points that Crook is making, and similar people arguing along those lines. Here are some of the structural challenges, which I've already started to point to. This is coming out of an Australian government report, often called the Bradley Report, looking at university entrance and university education, and suggesting changes that need to be put in place into the future. So from 2008. What we see here, participation rates in higher education versus proportion in the general population of people of these different groupings identified as markers of disadvantage. And then we get the participation ratio, which is just a straight division of this column with this column to get a sense of how the two are matching together. So people from a non-English speaking background around the level of representation in education is around about the same as in the general population. However, as I've said earlier, I'm interested to know which people from these non-English speaking backgrounds are we talking about, because I think that there is significant differentiation within this group that needs to be taken into account. If you have a look at these figures, the group least likely to go to university are those living in remote Australia, followed by students with disabilities, and then grouped together, people of low SES, low socioeconomic status, and Indigenous groups are about the same level of representation these days. That's a significant shift, I have to say, in the last decade or so. Indigenous people at about that same sort of would have had a much lower participation ratio 10, 15 years ago. And then coming from a rural or regional area is the next level to think about. Distance does make a big difference. If you start to look at a table like this, which are capturing some of the areas, you can look at this at your leisure, but you can see in a place like Western Australia, a huge state, which I'm going to talk about presently, you can see that the further away from Perth, the general rule is the further away you are from Perth, the less likely you are to be participating in education after post-compulsory education, after the age of 17, between 18 and 20 years old. Kimberley in particular, just look at that ratio, look at that total tertiary participation, a very, very low rate, particularly compared with the state average, and then especially when you start to compare it with people from the Perth area originally. Focusing on Australia as a whole, Marks found that students from independent schools score on average about 11 enter score points higher, and Catholic school students around 5 score points higher than government school students. Marks is talking here about university entrance scores. And his conclusion is pretty obvious there. I want to just quickly go through, as I indicated in the introduction, a quick overview of historical developments in education. Now, I'm going to look at it from the West Australian point of view, but I could just as easily be talking about other states. There will be variations, some local variations, but the general story is about the same. So schooling, 1830s is around about where it starts. We see a grammar school being developed for the higher orders, the upper classes. English school for the inferior classes, so just getting the basics in English and mathematics. These had public funding, but this public funding was later withdrawn. In the 1840s, Catholic schools got opened and they were free. Government schools followed closely on their heels, also for free. In 1895, a colonial government was elected in Western Australia, which went to the election with a clear mandate to abolish state aid to non-government schools. In other words, really what this amounted to was a defunding of the majority Catholic schools at that time. And it remained like this until the 1960s. So Catholic schools received little to no public funding up until that point. The 1899 Education Act declared free and compulsory education for all citizens up to the age of 14 years. Now, let's remember that we exist here in a federal system, as do many parts of the globe. A form of government uniting separate political entities within a single national system, allowing each political entity, or the state in this case, to retain its independence. And when it comes to education policy and education enactment, that is very much the case. It is the states that run education, with the funding coming mainly from federal government which is the major tax revenue raiser in the nation. So they have a significant impact then on how things are getting funded. And you can see these days federal government trying to get more and more control over the education process. Schooling post-World War II then in this federal system. In the 1950s, we see a welfarist expansion, secondary education for all. Now, sometimes it's hard to take hold of that idea that prior to World War II, secondary education was not compulsory and it was not available throughout the state, not at all. Comprehensive schooling became the policy of that time. So what, in the government school system at least, it was about making sure that all schools had the same resources available to them so that everybody got an equal access to education, equally well delivered. Now, of course, it never quite works out like that, particularly when you think about this state. And again, I'll come to some ideas about that in a moment. It was not until the 60s and the 70s that federal funding started to go again. Federal funding started to be made available to non-government school sector. Now, there's a whole lot of stories to tell in there, a whole lot of politics to talk about there. Won't go into that, except to make the point that Catholic education in this period, right up to the 60s, 70s, was very much working class education. It was an inferior education. It was being run by the volunteer labour of nuns and brothers, teaching large classes of students, and the outcomes were largely inferior to those of government schools. In the 1980s, we see then a movement towards neoliberalism. But just to, I guess a point though that I need to make then further about this, about the funding, is that in the 70s, Labour government comes to power and as a matter of equity decided to introduce funding to non-government, to Catholic schools. But of course it's not long before other school groups start to say, well, you cannot just fund one group, you have to fund all of them in one form or another. In the 1980s, neoliberal policies take hold. Thatcher and Reagan as the bellwethers in that regard, I guess. And in Australia, it was a Labour government that really started to neoliberalise Australia. Focus on diversification became very strong in this, devaluing the public in favour of the private. So the private is good, public bad. There's a whole selling off of public assets at this time, and there's a whole ways in which private systems start to get held up as the paragons of virtue. The public systems, bureaucratic, static, moribund in all sorts of ways. That became a very popular way of portraying all sorts of systems, but the education system certainly was one of them. The other thing that was happening around that time, very much in the Hawke and Keating years, schools get linked to national productivity as never before. Point I made in the introduction also about how education has got more and more linked to economics. We live very much in a world that is clearly dominated by the economic rationality, I suppose. What's the word I'm searching for? I'm not going to get it. A tripartite structure. Government schools. I have got it. Economic imperatives. So the economic becomes the imperative driving so much of this. Tripartite structure is what I'm talking about. Government schools, Catholic schools, independent schools. And as I say, independent schools are all of those non-government schools that are not Catholic schools. Catholic schools and independent schools, all funded from the public purse. All of them are, in one way or another, differently, different levels, but I think to call them private is a misnomer. They are not. They are government funded in one way or another. In 2010, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics Schools Australia report, 6,743 government schools, 1,708 Catholic schools, and that number of independent schools. You can see there the numbers growing in that non-government sector fairly significantly. Now I want to introduce an idea here about the sociology of choice, which I hope you can see is something of what I'm been arguing about in various ways. And I want to think about this in terms of the impetus of a second or a late modernity, or a neoliberal modernity could be another way to describe this. At a time when it seems like there's no choice but to choose. People talk about how in the 60s, 50s, 60s, you just went to your local school, for example. Now, to go to your local school, you have to make an active choice about it because there are other options available to you. And part of the logic of our time appears to be that you take responsibility as parent, as student, for your educational choices. And if things don't work out as they should for you in the end of it, well, you didn't choose quite right, did you? That's the kind of responsibility shifting away from the public very much into that private sphere. We've also been talking quite a bit about the increasing significance of further education beyond high school and the ways in which you will hear politicians say now, if you are not trained, you are not going to get proper work. In fact, you run the risk of being unemployed. So again, you can hear how shifting of responsibility for employment goes to the individual. Get yourself properly trained, and you will get this education, and you will get the sort of work that's needed at the end of it. I think that ignores some of the issues around actual supply next to demand in all of this, and I think it's tricky. So as a result, one of the things that we see happening is the ever receding goal. To get to particular positions you want to get to, you've got to get more and more and more education. Further and further and further education is required here. So I've come across people working as admin assistants who have a master's degree, and that, you know, they were the most. They were among several people with similar qualifications applying for those kind of positions. Valorization of the private over the public, as I've already mentioned. And the changing generational relations that I think that are part of this, that Cuervo and Wynne pick up in their book most certainly, but get me thinking about the ways in which parents these days have quite a different relationship with their children to how it probably was in the height of modernity, and the kind of conflicts that were being highlighted in the 60s, 70s, you know, between generations. I don't think you could argue that that's the same these days. I think about this as in terms of a practice approach, which we've been discussing, and I'll return to towards the end of this particular talk. I think we need to think about social class positioning in all of this, and when we start to think about educational choice, the significance of higher education family tradition, as it's sometimes called. So families with a higher education tradition are more likely to be positioning their children to get themselves to university. They know the benefits of it and are able to give them the kinds of, dare I say it, cultural capital that is needed, as well as, of course, the financial capital and social capital as well to get them there. The significance of place in all of this, so different types of positioning, geographic positioning, where you are in relation to the metropole in Australia certainly makes a difference, but in many parts of the world as well. And I think it's worth thinking about this through various choice stories, the statistical stories that can be told out of the numbers, and the personal stories that are also there. I'm not going to get too lost in that. I've been doing a lot of research in this area over the past several years. I just want to capture a few different elements, and I want to go back again to thinking about Western Australia. 2.5 million square kilometres, a third of the continent. This is a huge place, overwhelmingly central. In the Perth census, not the Perth census, Australian census of 2011 showing 77.4% of the population residing in Perth, of the state population residing in Perth. And that is a fact that is overwhelming in a way, and should get you thinking about, if you're running an education system, think about the implications of that. I've been doing some research in a place called Karratha, 1,535 kilometres north of Perth. It is officially remote. It's an oil and gas and an iron ore town. It's basically a place where these resources get dispatched to areas of South and East Asia. It has been one of the epicenters of global capitalism in the past decade. No question about that. Enormous amounts of wealth have been generated out of these areas. Huge turnovers in money. I would say it's an epicenter of mobile modernity as a consequence of that. And mobile modernity, I think, is tied up quite strongly with education. It's part of what I want to argue. So look at these figures just to help exemplify this point. So when I looked at the 2011 census recently, I noticed a declining proportion of young people as we go across the age group. So between 0 and 20 at each year group, I just plotted here next to state average, running here in the grey, and the Perth average running next to it. As you can see, Perth average and state average stay pretty much the same, except we've got a little takeoff point there. Come back to that in a moment. This is the Karratha average, and as you can see, around about 11 or 12, and 11 to 12, enormous decline. It's a static picture, it's a point in time, census night 2011, but I think it tells us quite a story. I think it's an education story. Look at this. I then decided, based on this little rise here, I thought I'd have a look at the Perth story, so 77.4% of the population on average residing in Perth at that point in that time. Let's have a look at, I just took in 4-year groupings, just tallied them up and worked it out, and as you can see, we get an increasing proportion of people in this age group between 12 and 20 in Perth. Certainly between 16 and 20 are well above the average for Perth overall, and starting to decline again. Now, if we think about what we know about education and its drivers and the drivers for young people to get qualifications, the place where you best get that is in the large metropolitan area of this state, and we can see, I think in here, we can probably see reasons for that. But of course we need to get underneath those stories and start asking some of those questions, and maybe some of you are doing that in the research you've just been doing. This here, well, that's an interesting part of it. Do people come back to Perth to die? Don't know. I mean, I think there's other reasons for that. I'm not going to go into that now. Karratha, 2006 census. 56 and 24% of Karratha residents lived at their current address 1 and 5 years respectively, compared to 75 and 48% for the state. Enormous churn in the population. The North West Shelf Joint Venture, which runs the oil and gas industry up in Karratha, estimated that this churn in population, the employee churn that this reflected, was costing them up to $15 million per year around about that time. And they also identified through their research that the transition to high school was the key decision-making point for this. And parents reported on the quality of education being of real concern for them, teacher quality especially, and teacher churn is a huge factor in places like that. I could tell you a few stories about that, but the turnover of staff in remote schools is enormous. A lot of people want to get themselves back to Perth, where their friends, where their family is. Student academic performance was then part of what was being discussed in all of this. So parents making choices about that, which I think you can start to see in a graph such as that. And of course parents aren't doing it by themselves, the students are probably part of that decision making. There's some bigger stories to tell with that. I don't have time to go into it here. Go to some other graphs. Government school enrolments from 2000 to 2010, you can see declining, and not insignificantly, but never lose sight of the ways in which graphs get constructed. From 65 down to 60, if that was spread out, it would look much less. Of course it would. Here we see fairly static enrolments in Catholic, just slight sort of rises, bigger rises happening in the independent schools. So the flow from here is mainly into the independent school sector. I just want to remind you about these figures that I showed in the introduction from the Gonski report, proportion of enrolment by SES and school sector, and also remind you about these different categories that were there. Now, don't lose sight of these figures. I think they can be helpful for you in telling stories about Australia. And also, those of you who are not from Australia tapping into this, start to think about your own place and how the figures might start to look there. See if you can locate some. Start to look around you there. Making this point again, reiterating this point from Marx about if you went to an independent school, you're more likely to get a higher enter score, so a higher university entrance score than students from Catholic schools, who in turn were scoring higher than students coming out of government schools. Now again, there is a big debate around this as to what factors are at play here. To what extent are we seeing just simple straight out social class factors? But there is no doubt that people are saying that even when you are able to control 4 variables such as socioeconomic status, if students at independent schools are likely to score better. And of course one of the reasons for that becomes one of the big questions around this, and no doubt you've got some thoughts on that yourself. Reproduction theory suggests that it's through the educational encounter that individuals are induced to accept the degree of powerlessness with which they will be faced as mature workers. So Bowles and Gintis are pretty clear that the kind of figures that Marx is talking about there indicate the ways in which people get just positioned by schooling and get it. These differences between groups, which are essentially class differences, are naturalized by a clouded sense of achievement. It's because, and what Bowles and Gintis are saying is, you can only achieve well if you come from the right class background, as a general rule. Now, the problem with reproductionism, as much as it shed a strong light on a system that had not been subject to that level of critique before, is it does focus on deficit, what people don't have, and how we're measuring success in all of this becomes one of the interesting questions. In a place like Australia, one doesn't necessarily have to achieve high educational qualifications to be earning quite a lot of money. Blue-collar affluence is one of the striking features of the contemporary Australian social landscape. It's also the problem of structural determinism. You're born in the slum, you'll die in the slum. That kind of an idea. Now, statistically, that is probably a fair enough call, but it does lose track and lose our ability to see the ways in which people also do change and the ways in which society does change. Part of the point, I guess, that Crookes is making in his argument, the arguments I pointed to earlier from his defence of a modernising theory of education. I've already highlighted what Bourdieu and Passeron have to say about reproduction and the ways in which they throw a cultural argument at this. Cultural capital is one of Bourdieu's most enduring ideas. If you go to something like the British Journal of Sociology of Education, habitus and cultural capital are probably the two most favoured ideas that people deal with in there. Cultural capital, just to reiterate points here, symbolic credit acquired through learning to embody and enact signs of social standing. Now, learning can be formal and informal. Let's get that clear. The way one talks, dresses, writes, comports, what one reads, is knowledgeable of, is part of what we can talk about in terms of cultural capital. And what Bourdieu is arguing is that schools examine these things, these aspects of life. This is really what gets measured. How well one knows one's Shakespeare, how well one is able to write, how well one presents oneself, one's knowledge of that museums bring, the ideas that come from from reading, from having access to particular types of knowledge, but it is particular types of books, particular types of ideas that are presented as the natural way of measuring intelligence, of measuring achievement. Cultural capital is converted to economic capital through advanced academic credentials, and the highly skewed valuations of cultural styles and competencies buttresses an unequal social order. It buttresses it, it naturalises it, is really what Bourdieu was suggesting. Schools give those of superior social standing an unfair advantage in reproducing their stocks of cultural capital. Life chances are culturally determined, is part of the argument that's there. Now, because we would be a mistake to think that Bourdieu is saying that in any absolute sense. He would say, of course, there's an ability for change, but structures work in the way that they do and make it difficult for such changes to take place. But changes do take place, and we do need to acknowledge that. And there's no doubt also that when we start to think about structured agency, that Bourdieu is one of the key thinkers that has allowed us to think our way to this and through these sorts of ideas. And what I would be saying when I start to think about the choice stories that I'm starting to highlight that underpin some of the information I've thrown your way. Teachers, administrators, parents, students are involved in reinforcing the old and always simultaneously creating something new out of the limited frameworks and cultural schemas that are structuring their thoughts and actions. Cultured, structured agency. That's what practice series seems to be about. And in the reading you've been doing this week, Tranter makes the point about habitus being the inquired and embodied dispositions, understandings of the world that emerge from objective structures and personal history. So the individual absorbing all that is around, but is also the individual. We adapt to our surroundings in our own particular way, through our own particular psychology, through our own organism adapting in the way that it does. Students reach the stage, argues Tranter, where their experience at university has moved them away from the habitus within which they grew up. So working class kids start to take on a different type of habitus through the university experience. And maybe some of you can resonate with that and relate to that in some ways. Maybe you don't in others. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. But of course the point that she's making here is that it's not determined. This is practice theory very much at play in all of this. It's not the same as the Bowles and Ginter's very much cruder form of analysis of this. Understanding how the game is played and how to win forms part of the habitus. The more practice or experience one has with the game, using a very Bourdieuian metaphor there, the stronger the habitus. What about stronger? I have trouble with that idea of the stronger the habitus, but certainly it starts to change in that way. The more successful one is likely to be. So if we start to think about practice, structuration, reproduction type of ideas, reproduction with the hyphen, we're talking about structured agency. Teachers, administrators reinforcing the old, creating something new out of the limited frameworks that are available to them. Make sure you grasp the implications of ascription and achievement, understand the idea of habitus, cultural capital and its applications, understanding the difference between reproductionist approaches to education, modernization approaches, further developing your understanding of practice and structuration theory. One of the challenges I want to keep throwing your way now is to start applying these ideas into the stories that you're gathering, either of your own story or the interviews that you've been doing for those of you from UWA and are starting to write your assignment. Thanks for that. Some of the further consolidation exercises follow from this. Catch you up with you soon.